This reading was in my inbox this morning, and it's very appropriate to our talk about the spiritual path and assumptions. The reality is that, noticed or not, every conscious act that gives witness to new possibilities and greater awareness contributes to the transformation of the whole. There is no insignificant thought, word, or action. Each act of courage and strength shifts the energy and increases the potential for others to become aware too. No matter what we do, we are always affecting the energy around us in either a negative or a positive way. Why should we not then become aware of our power and choose consciously, rather than unconsciously, how we will shape our world? Conscious. That's what this book is about, the Fifth Agreement. It's about coming back to consciousness. And so the first agreement, we're asked to be impeccable with our word. We notice how we speak about ourselves. We notice how we speak about other people. We pay attention. Are we speaking lovingly about ourselves? In the meditation, my purpose was to begin to change that paradigm in our heads, that we look in the mirror and we begin to notice every little imperfection. No, that meditation was about acknowledging our wonderful body and all the wonderful service it does. And it's perfection. It's perfection. The second agreement is about not taking things personally. People come at us with unkind words or unkind actions. It's coming through their filter, through their perception. It has nothing to do with us. And so when we remember that it's about them, and that we are okay just the way we are, that we are perfect just the way we are, we become immune to the negative opinions of others. Because we can stand in our own truth, the truth that we are the beloved of the divine. Remember, Myrtle Fillmore heard the words, "You are a child of God and you don't inherit sickness." And she took that to heart and she bathed every cell in her body in love. And she spoke to parts of her body the words of love, words of healing. Because she knew who she was. And nothing outside of her could bring her off center because she knew. She never took anything personally because she knew who she was. And so the author reminds us to remember who we are. We are beloved of the divine. We are perfect. And that leads us to our third agreement, which is don't make assumptions. And Keisha picked out a really funny graphic that I'm going to show you. I don't know if you can see it. Can you see what that is? Yeah. Do you guys know that it's a little donkey? It's a donkey, and we know the other word for a donkey. And so we have the word assume, and you know when you assume, you make a donkey out of you and me. Have you ever heard that little adage? So I thought Keisha picked that out for us. Don't make assumptions. Don't make assumptions. Okay, you can take it down now and put the other one back. Okay, so what is an assumption? An assumption is based on erroneous information, right? We're making a decision or we're saying something based on something we think we know, right? And it may or may not be true. The author points out that we are acculturated, we're indoctrinated from an early on about limited thinking about ourselves, limited thinking about other people. And he talks about thinking leads to assumptions. And assumptions often get us in trouble. Why? Because a lot of times they cause us to not communicate with one another, right? How many times have you been, working with a colleague or a friend, and you're working on a project, and one colleague assumes that the other colleague is doing an important piece of the work, and guess what? The work never happens, right? Has it ever happened to you guys? Or you make a suggestion to somebody, oh, you might try that, and automatically you get, oh, that wouldn't work, right? Has that ever happened to you where someone just automatically shuts down something that you suggest because they just assume, right, that it won't work without even trying it? So when we make assumptions, we're operating on limited thinking. We're operating out of that limited way of being. As parents, we often go down that road of assumption. And it's interesting that my son is here today because one of the anecdotes I'm going to use is based on my son. So it's actually a really good one. So, and I use it a lot because in my opinion, it's a really good illustration of don't make assumptions. So when he was 17 and you're on a provisional license, right? And you have to be back by midnight when you're driving. And so 11:30 rolls around and my antennas are going off. Just not quite yet, but they're starting to. Quarter of 12, I get a phone call. Mom, please come up to the 7-Eleven up the street. And I'm going to, Mom, don't ask me questions. Just come to the 7-Eleven up the street. So at that time, I had gotten on the spiritual path, and so I'm having a little argument inside of my head. And the human limited part of myself wants to go into fear and oh my gosh, and you know how one thing leads to another, and so my brain wants to go down that disaster path. And my spiritual path, thank goodness, the spiritual part of me that had learned a few things took over and said, just do what he says, relax, just do what he says. So I get up to the 7-Eleven, and there is my son with a very drunk man, and he has talked this man out of getting into his car. And he needed me to drive up there and drive this man home, okay? And then we drove our car back. He followed me in our car. But consider that. What if I had gone into my assumptions of fear? What if I had gone into my negative assumptions? Would have turned out really differently, wouldn't it have? So consider, we're asked to consider carefully. When are we making assumptions about ourselves, about other people? As a camp director, I was in charge of a staff of 50 young people every summer. And no matter how much I would tell them to come and ask questions, to communicate, inevitably, at least once a week, I would have to smooth ruffled feathers because of assumptions that were made, because of failure to communicate. So not assuming means let's speak from our heart. Let's not be afraid to ask that question, right? To get that information. Let's not operate out of a fear of, oh, I better not say this thing, or I'm afraid if I might offend this person by asking this question. If you're coming from a genuine place of love and centeredness, what's the problem, right? So instead of making assumptions, let's communicate with each other, right? Let's go into our spiritual place and find out what is the truth. What is true here in this situation? What's true for me? What's true for this person? Because whenever we go back to spirit, we're going to find the truth, right? We're going to find the truth. We're going to get to that place of love. So assumptions are always coming out of fear. They're coming out of limited thinking. And when we stop making assumptions, we come out of that place of love, that place that knows it's perfect, that place that's connected with the divine and knows that all is well, right? So I'm going to show you a little video that is kind of a good illustration of how assumptions can appear in the artistic world. So here's our little video. I want to put these lights off, maybe. So we're not having any sound. Right, exactly. There, we assume it's all going to work, right? Right? Everything is fodder. Remember my other talk where everything that comes at you, you can look at for information, right? Information.
Cool. He lives fast as a self-made millionaire.
You didn't have to dress up. It's all right.
You're going to photograph Michael. He's actually saved somebody's life. Michael is an ex-inmate. He's a commercial fisherman. Michael claims to be psychic.
Nice to meet you.
Michael's a former alcoholic. Here's your camera. I would like you to flesh out the essence of who he is.
What would you like out of this? What would you like the photograph to say about you?
Do you find that being a psychic impacts much on your day-to-day life?
I can see this is emotional for you.
Like to get to know the person.
You've only got 10 minutes, right?
I think you're a guy that's put yourself out there. You're not hiding anything. My plan was to find out about whoever it was and to try and get that. And what I learned from him is he's incredibly brave.
That was really intense. Pull his shirt out. Sorry.
I wanted to see the nature of the person, which then present a challenge. How do you portray him as a fisherman?
That's perfect.
He's a self-made millionaire and sort of a little bit intimidating. I wasn't going for a beautiful, nice, perfectly lit portrait.
I just want to try and bring out something of who you are. I think that you just treat people like the everyday people, like everybody is.
Pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, I hope I've got that guy's bravery on film.
So it was a very intimidating environment.
Can't see your work.
I like that empty chair next to it too.
Because this is a totally different person.
Almost looks like 6 different people. So not everything I told you today was true. I'm not a fisherman. I am not an alcoholic. The GFC hit me hard, but I've never been a millionaire. Never been in prison. I am a Bondi lifesaver, but the story we talked about never did happen. Not psychic. Can barely spell it.
Before I knew there were different characters in each of these, I thought, that's really strange. These don't look like portraits of the character I thought you were. You always got your own preconceptions and you've got your ideas.
It pushed me into a position and a space that I wouldn't normally be in.
You have to dig a lot deeper. It means you've got to be, I think you're a lot more creative to work out how you're going to play things.
So, don't make assumptions. Don't make assumptions. Remember, he talks about, in the book, he talks about truth and lies. And we're told a lot of lies as we're growing up, right? The worst of which is that we're imperfect. Nobody's perfect, he points out. But guess what? As we step on the spiritual path, we begin to remember our connectedness. We begin to remember our perfection because we come together every week to remind one another and lift one another up. Okay? So I'm going to give you a quote from the book that I really thought was pretty powerful. Don Miguel says, If we don't make assumptions, we can focus our attention on the truth, not what we think is the truth. Then we see life the way it is, the way we want to see it. And what shall we see when we don't and believe our assumptions? The power of our belief that we invested in our assumptions returns to us. When we recover all of the energy that we invested in making assumptions, we can use that energy to create a new dream, our personal heaven. So let's start creating our personal heaven. Practice self-awareness. Pay attention to your words, thoughts, and feelings. Be kind to yourself. Appreciate your body. Notice when you might be making an erroneous assumption. Communicate. Ask questions when you're uncertain about what to do or say. Let love and common sense prevail in all of your interactions. And I close with a wonderful little story that Jean, our bookkeeper, sent around this week. I just love it, but I'm going to get my glasses on so I don't miss a piece of it. It's a story called Potato Chips. A little boy wanted to meet God. He knew it was a long trip to where God lived, so he packed his suitcase with a bag of potato chips and a 6-pack of root beer and started his journey. When he'd gone about 3 blocks, he met an old man. He was sitting in the park, just staring at some pigeons. When the boy sat down next to him, he opened his suitcase. He was about to take a drink from his root beer when he noticed that the old man looked hungry. So he offered him some chips. This he gratefully accepted with a smile. His smile was so pretty that the boy wanted to see it again, so he offered him a root beer. Again, he smiled at him. The boy was delighted. They sat there all afternoon, eating and smiling, but they never said a word. As twilight approached, the boy realized how tired he was, and he got up to leave. But before he'd gone more than a few steps, he turned around, ran back to the old man, gave him a great big hug, and gave him his biggest smile ever. When the boy opened the door to his own house a short time later, the mother was surprised by the look of joy on his face. She asked him, "What did you do today that made you so happy?" He replied, "I had lunch with God." But before his mother could respond, he added, "You know what? He's got the most beautiful smile I've ever seen." Meanwhile, the old man, also radiant with joy, returned to his home. His son was stunned by the look of peace on his face and asked, "Dad, what did you do today that made you so happy?" He replied, "I ate potato chips in the park with God." However, before the son could respond, he added, "You know, he's much younger than I expected." So let's say our affirmation together. I put aside my assumptions and acknowledge the truth of my being. I am perfect.